On the most important day of her life, he humiliated her, rejecting her in front of everyone. The pain was so deep, she thought she would never rise again. But what no one knew was that his cruel rejection would become the twist that saved her life and changed her fate forever. The silence was deafening when Darius awakened to emptiness that morning. The space beside him in their shared bed was cold, untouched, as if Helena had never existed at all. No warmth lingered in the sheets. No trace of her lavender scent remained on the pillow, and most crushing of all, no farewell note explained why the woman who had shared his life for decades had simply vanished without a whisper of goodbye. Darius sat up slowly, his powerful frame trembling with something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. As the leader of the ancient mountain community of Ravencrest, he commanded respect through strength and decisive action. But now, staring at the hollow impression where Helena should have been, he felt more lost than a child abandoned in the wilderness. How could someone so integral to his existence disappear as if she were nothing more than morning mist? The stone walls of their chamber felt like they were closing in, each weathered brick a witness to their shared intimacy, their whispered conversations, their plans for the future that would never come to pass. Darius dragged his hands through his dark hair, fighting against the panic rising in his chest. Leaders didn't panic, leaders didn't break. But Helena hadn't just been anyone. She had been his anchor, his conscience, the gentle voice that tempered his sometimes harsh decisions. Outside, the mountain winds howled through the narrow valleys that surrounded Ravencrest, carrying with them the scent of pine and the promise of winter storms. The community had been built into the mountainside centuries ago, its buildings carved from the living rock, connected by passages that wound through the peaks like ancient arteries. It was a place of tradition, of rigid hierarchy, where every person knew their role and the consequences of stepping outside it. But traditions felt meaningless when the one person who mattered most had broken the most fundamental rule of all. She had left without explanation. Darius forced himself to rise, to dress in the simple but well-crafted clothes that marked his station. The leather vest, dyed deep burgundy, bore the intricate knotwork that symbolized his leadership. The silver torque around his neck had been worn by leaders before him for 7 generations. Yet these symbols of authority felt like chains now, binding him to responsibilities he no longer understood how to bear alone. The Great Hall was already bustling with morning activity when he descended the carved stone steps. Members of the community moved with purposeful efficiency, tending to daily tasks that had remained unchanged for generations. But their glances toward him were different today. Where once he had seen respect and confidence, now he detected something else: pity. Word of Helena's disappearance had already spread through the tight-knit community like wildfire through dry grass. Elder Matthias approached with measured steps, his weathered face grave beneath his silver beard. "Any word?" he asked quietly, though they both knew the answer. "Nothing," Darius replied, his voice rougher than intended. "It's as if she never existed." Matthias's eyes held depths of knowledge that came from decades of guiding the community through crises. The search parties found no tracks leading away from Ravencrest, no signs of struggle, no evidence of... He paused delicately. "Of what?" "Foul play." Darius's laugh was bitter. "Perhaps that would be easier to accept than the truth, that she chose to leave me." "We don't know that's what happened," Matthias said firmly. "Helena loved this community. She loved... Don't." The word came out sharper than Darius intended, causing several nearby community members to glance their way with barely concealed curiosity. He lowered his voice. "Don't speak of what she loved. If she loved anything here, she would have stayed." The elder's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. "Grief makes us say things we don't mean, my boy. But the community needs its leader now more than ever. There are concerns." Darius felt his jaw tighten. What kind of concerns? Young Marcus has been asking questions about the succession protocols. Some of the newer families are wondering about stability. And there are whispers about the old prophecies, the ones that speak of times of transition, when leadership changes hands during periods of great upheaval. The implications hit Darius like a physical blow. Not only had he lost Helena, but her disappearance was being interpreted as a sign of his weakness, his inability to maintain even his own household, let alone lead an entire community. The respect he had spent years building was crumbling as quickly as Helena's presence had vanished. Tell Marcus and anyone else with concerns that I remain their leader until the community decides otherwise, through proper channels, Darius said, his voice carrying the authority that had once come so naturally to him. Helena's personal choice doesn't reflect on my ability to serve Ravencrest. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. How could he lead others when he couldn't understand his own life? How could he make decisions for the community when he had failed to see the signs that his closest companion was planning to leave? The days that followed blurred together in a haze of routine responsibilities and private anguish. Darius attended council meetings where he made decisions about water rights and resource allocation. He mediated disputes between families and approved trade agreements with neighboring settlements. He performed all the functions of leadership while feeling increasingly hollow inside, like an actor playing a role he no longer understood. The nights were the worst. Alone in the chambers he had shared with Helena, surrounded by her possessions that remained exactly as she had left them, Darius found himself searching for clues he might have missed. He examined her clothes for signs of planned departure, read through her personal papers for hints of discontent, even questioned whether their relationship had been as strong as he believed. Had there been signs he ignored, conversations he dismissed, moments when she had tried to tell him something important, but he had been too focused on community concerns to truly listen? The questions multiplied like thorns in his mind, each one drawing blood from his already wounded confidence. 3 weeks after Helena's disappearance, on a morning when the autumn mist clung to the mountain peaks like ghostly fingers, everything changed again. A lone figure emerged from the treacherous path that led up from the lower valleys, a path so dangerous that few attempted it without guides, and fewer still succeeded alone. The stranger was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with auburn hair that caught the weak sunlight like burnished copper. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to difficult terrain, carrying a weathered leather pack and a staff carved from mountain ash. But it wasn't her appearance that drew attention. It was the way she surveyed Ravencrest with eyes that seemed to see too much, as if she were cataloging secrets the community thought it had kept hidden. Darius watched from the steps of the Great Hall as she approached the main gate. There was something about her presence that stirred feelings he thought had died with Helena's departure. Not romantic interest, but a recognition of strength, of someone who carried their own burdens with dignity. "Who seeks entry to Ravencrest?" called Garrett, the gate guardian, following protocols that had been established centuries ago. The young woman's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, melodic but firm. "I am Serena of the Southern Valleys. I seek sanctuary and offer my services as a healer in exchange for shelter and sustenance." A murmur ran through the gathered community members. Healers were always welcome in mountain settlements, where injuries and illnesses could quickly become life-threatening without proper care. But there was something about this particular arrival that felt significant, as if the fates themselves had guided her steps to their door. Darius found himself walking forward before he consciously decided to do so. "What brings you to our isolated peaks, Serena of the Southern Valleys? The path you've taken is dangerous for experienced climbers, let alone..." He paused, studying her more closely. Despite her youth, there was a weariness in her green eyes that spoke of experiences beyond her years. "I go where I'm needed," she replied simply. "And something about this place called to me." There was truth in her words, Darius sensed, but not the complete truth. Still, the community's need for a healer was genuine. Their previous medicine woman had died the winter before, leaving them dependent on remedies passed down through families and the uncertain skills of those who remembered fragments of healing knowledge. "Elder Matthias," Darius called to the older man, who had been observing the exchange with keen interest. "Please escort our visitor to the healing quarters. If her skills prove adequate, we will discuss terms for her stay." As Serena was led away, Darius caught her glancing back at him with an expression that seemed almost knowing, as if she had seen past his composed exterior to the grief and confusion he worked so hard to hide from his people. That night, as he lay alone in his 2 empty chambers, Darius found himself thinking not of Helena's absence for the first time in weeks, but of green eyes that seemed to hold depths of compassion he hadn't expected to encounter again. The thought troubled him. He wasn't ready to feel anything beyond grief, wasn't prepared to acknowledge that life continued beyond loss. But the mountain winds that howled through Ravencrest seemed to carry whispers of change, and deep in his heart, Darius knew that the arrival of the mysterious healer would alter the course of his carefully controlled existence in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The next morning brought the first test of Serena's abilities. Young Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice, had suffered a severe burn while working the forge, and the usual remedies weren't helping. The infection was spreading, and without proper treatment, he faced the loss of his hand or worse. Darius accompanied Elder Matthias to observe as Serena examined the injury. She worked with quiet confidence, cleaning the wound with solutions that smelled of herbs he didn't recognize, applying poultices that drew out the infection with remarkable efficiency. But it was her manner with the frightened young man that impressed him most. She spoke to Thomas with gentle authority, explaining each step of the treatment, never talking down to him despite his obvious fear. "Where did you learn these techniques?" Matthias asked as she wrapped the hand in clean bandages that had been soaked in some aromatic solution. "From necessity," Serena replied. "My own community faced challenges that required everyone to learn healing skills quickly." There was pain behind those carefully chosen words, Darius realized. This young woman carried her own losses, her own griefs. Perhaps that was why she seemed to understand the shadows that had taken residence in his heart since Helena's departure. Over the following days, word of Serena's healing abilities spread throughout Ravencrest. She treated ailments that had plagued families for years, some with remedies so simple that the community's previous healers had overlooked them entirely. But she also identified problems that ran deeper than physical symptoms. The way chronic pain had made Elder Sarah irritable and withdrawn, how young David's learning difficulties stemmed from a childhood injury that had never properly healed. More troubling, she began to notice patterns that the community had accepted as normal, but which raised concerns in her experienced eyes. Too many people suffered from digestive ailments during certain seasons. Several families reported strange dreams and memory problems. The symptoms were subtle enough that individually they seemed unremarkable, but taken together, they suggested something more sinister. "Has anyone tested your water sources recently?" Serena asked Darius during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about the community's health. They were walking through the terraced gardens, where Ravencrest grew much of its food, the autumn harvest nearly complete. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended plots, and the air held the crisp promise of winter's approach. "Tested them for what?" Darius asked, though something in her tone put him on alert. "Contamination. Some of the symptoms I'm seeing could indicate exposure to certain plant toxins. They grow in mountain regions, but typically only in specific conditions." Darius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "You think someone might be poisoning our water?" I think someone with knowledge of mountain flora might know how to create conditions that would naturally produce the effects I'm observing, Serena replied carefully. It wouldn't require direct poisoning if the circumstances were arranged properly. The implications staggered him. If she was right, then Helena's disappearance might not have been a personal choice at all. She might have discovered something that put her in danger, something that forced her to leave without explanation, to protect herself or the community. For the first time since that terrible morning when he had awakened to emptiness, Darius felt something other than grief and self-doubt. He felt the stirring of anger, of purpose, of the protective instincts that had made him a leader in the first place. "What do you need to investigate this theory?" he asked. Serena studied his face, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Access to your water sources, obviously. Samples of the plants growing near them. And," she hesitated, "and any records Helena might have kept. If she suspected something, she might have documented her concerns. The suggestion that Helena might have left clues behind, evidence that her departure wasn't abandonment, but protection, filled Darius with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that she hadn't simply stopped loving him, dread at what they might discover if Serena's suspicions proved correct. That night, for the first time since Helena's disappearance, Darius began searching their shared chambers, not for signs of her planning to leave, but for indications of what she might have discovered before she left. And in the locked drawer of her writing desk, hidden beneath letters from distant relatives and pressed flowers from their courtship, he found a collection of notes that made his blood run cold. Helena had indeed been investigating strange illnesses in the community. She had mapped the water sources and noted which families were affected most severely. She had identified several species of toxic plants growing in unusual abundance near their primary wells. And in her final entry, dated just 3 days before her disappearance, she had written words that changed everything Darius thought he knew about her leaving. "I can no longer trust the council. Someone among our leaders knows what's happening and has chosen to allow it to continue. I must find a way to protect our people, even if it means sacrificing everything I hold dear." Darius stared at Helena's familiar handwriting until the words blurred through his tears. She hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She had left because she loved their community too much to let it be slowly destroyed from within. And if her suspicions were correct, then her disappearance might not have been voluntary at all. But if someone in Ravencrest's leadership was involved in poisoning their own people, then who could he trust? Who among his advisors and council members might be betraying the very community they had sworn to protect? As the mountain winds howled outside his windows, Darius realized that Helena's disappearance was only the beginning of a mystery that threatened the very foundation of everything he had believed about Ravencrest and his role in protecting it. And the green-eyed healer who had arrived at their gates might be either his salvation or another piece in a deadly puzzle he was only beginning to understand. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of ancient peaks and the deeper shadows of human betrayal. But whatever the cost, whatever the revelations might destroy, Darius knew he would uncover it all. For Helena, for his community, and for the growing certainty that the mysterious Serena held keys to secrets that could either save them all or destroy everything they held sacred. The hunt for truth had begun, and with it, a journey that would transform not just his understanding of recent events, but his very conception of leadership, loyalty, and the price of love in a world where ancient traditions clashed with modern threats in ways none of them had imagined possible. The dawn mist clung to the mountain peaks like shrouds when Darius found Serena collecting water samples from the eastern well. She worked with methodical precision, filling small glass vials and labeling each one with careful script. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, but several strands had escaped to frame her face as she bent over her work. and Darius found himself studying the elegant curve of her neck before forcing his attention back to the reason he had sought her out. "I found something," he said without preamble, holding out Helena's journal. "You were right about the investigation." Serena straightened slowly, her green eyes moving from the leather-bound book to his face. In the pale morning light, he could see the exhaustion that lined her features. She had been working through the night, testing water from every source in Ravencrest. What did she discover? That someone in our leadership knows about the poisoning and has chosen to allow it to continue. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. 3 days before she disappeared, Helena wrote that she could no longer trust the council. Serena's hands stilled on the water sample she had been securing. Which council members had access to her research? All of them. Darius ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that was becoming habitual as his carefully ordered world continued to unravel. "We've always operated on the principle of complete transparency among the leadership." Helena would have shared her concerns with Elder Matthias, Elder Sarah, Marcus, and probably Thomas the Builder as well. And any one of them could have warned whoever is behind this. Serena set down her testing equipment and faced him fully. "Darius, if Helena was forced to leave because she discovered something that threatened the poisoner's plans, then she might still be alive. But she would have had to go somewhere she felt safe, somewhere her knowledge couldn't be used against her." The possibility that Helena might be alive sent a surge of hope through Darius's chest, followed immediately by a darker realization. If she's alive and in hiding, why hasn't she tried to contact me? Why hasn't she sent word that she's safe? "Because," Serena said gently, "she can't be certain you weren't involved." The words hit him like a physical blow. Helena, the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams for decades, had suspected him of betraying their own people. The thought was so devastating that for a moment, Darius couldn't breathe. "That's impossible," he whispered. "She knew me better than anyone. She would have known." "Would she?" Serena's voice was soft but relentless. "If someone in the leadership is orchestrating this poisoning, they would need someone with ultimate authority to prevent investigation, to dismiss concerns, to maintain the status quo while people slowly sickened. The leader would be the perfect cover." Darius stared at her, seeing his own reflection in her eyes and recognizing the terrible logic of her words. From Helena's perspective, his position would have made him either the most dangerous conspirator or the most dangerous person to trust with the truth. Either way, she would have had to leave without telling him. "How do I prove I wasn't involved?" he asked finally. "You helped me find the truth," Serena replied, "but you need to understand, once we start down this path, there's no going back. If we expose what's happening here, it will destroy relationships, topple traditions, and change Ravencrest forever. Are you prepared for that?" Darius looked out over the community he had led for 15 years, watching his people begin their daily routines with no knowledge that their leaders might be slowly poisoning them. Children ran between the buildings, playing games their grandparents had played. Adults moved with the confident efficiency of people secure in their traditions and their place in the world. Everything looked peaceful, normal, eternal. "Helena was prepared to sacrifice everything to protect them," he said quietly. "I can do no less." Serena nodded, and he caught a flash of something that might have been approval in her expression. "Then we start with the water sources and work backward. If someone is introducing toxins into your supply, there will be evidence. They spent the morning examining every well, spring, and collected rainwater cistern in Ravencrest." Serena taught Darius to recognize the signs she was looking for: unusual plant growth near water sources, discoloration in stones that might indicate chemical contamination, and the subtle differences in plant health that could reveal toxic exposure. What they found was more disturbing than either had expected. Someone had indeed been cultivating toxic plants near the water sources, but they had done so with knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity with both the local ecosystem and the community's water usage patterns. The poisoner knew exactly which wells served which families, which sources were used during different seasons, and how to time the contamination for maximum effect with minimum detectability. "This isn't random," Serena said, as they crouched beside the northern well, examining pale, sickly plants that should not have been growing in the mineral-rich soil. "Someone has been planning this for years. Look at these root systems. They're established, mature. This contamination has been ongoing for at least 3 seasons, possibly longer." Darius felt sick. While he had been focused on trade negotiations and resource allocation, someone had been systematically poisoning his people. Worse, the timeline suggested the planning had begun long before Helena's investigation, which meant the poisoner had been operating under his nose with impunity. "Could Helena have discovered who was doing this?" he asked. "If she followed the same investigative path we're following, yes." Serena stood, brushing soil from her hands. "The question is whether she confronted them directly or tried to gather more evidence first." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Elder Matthias emerged from the path that led to the main settlement, his expression troubled. "Darius, we need to speak. There's been another incident." "What kind of incident?" Darius asked, but he was already dreading the answer. Young Rebecca collapsed during morning chores. "She's conscious but disoriented, and her symptoms—" Matthias glanced at Serena uncertainly. "They're consistent with what our healer has been treating in others." Serena was already moving toward her supplies. "How long ago did this happen?" "Perhaps an hour. Her mother is with her now, but she's asking for you specifically." Matthias's tone carried an undercurrent of something that might have been suspicion. "It's interesting how many medical emergencies we've had since your arrival." The implication hung in the air like a blade. Darius felt Serena tense beside him, and he realized with sudden clarity that their investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous. If someone was willing to accelerate the poisoning, to discredit Serena or distract from their research, then the stakes were higher than they had imagined. "Elder Matthias," Darius said carefully, "are you suggesting that our healer is somehow responsible for causing the illnesses she's been treating?" "I'm suggesting that the timing is suspicious," Matthias replied. "We had these symptoms before, but they were sporadic, easily explained. Now suddenly, they're occurring more frequently and with greater severity." Serena stepped forward, and Darius could see the careful control she was exercising over her emotions. "If you're questioning my abilities or my intentions, Elder Matthias, I understand. But right now, a young woman needs medical attention. We can discuss your concerns after I've ensured she's stable." There was steel beneath the softness of her voice, and Darius found himself impressed by her composure under implied accusation. But he also recognized the trap that was closing around them. If Rebecca's condition worsened despite Serena's treatment, it would fuel suspicions about her involvement. If it improved too quickly, it might suggest she had caused it in the first place. "I'll accompany you," he said. "Elder Matthias, please gather the full council for a meeting this afternoon. We have matters to discuss." As they walked toward Rebecca's family dwelling, Serena spoke quietly. "This isn't coincidence. Someone knows we're investigating and they're trying to discredit me. Or test us," Darius replied. "Rebecca is Marcus's daughter. If someone wanted to force a confrontation with the council's most ambitious member, this would be an effective way to do it." They found Rebecca in her family's main room, pale and shaking, despite the warm blankets wrapped around her. Her mother, Eleanor, looked up as they entered, relief and worry warring in her expression. "Thank the mountains you're here," Elena said to Serena. She was fine when she woke up, but then she started having those spells again. The confusion, the nausea, and this time there's something else. "What kind of something else?" Serena asked, already kneeling beside the young woman. "She keeps talking about seeing things that aren't there." shadows moving when there's no light, voices whispering when no one's speaking. Elena's voice dropped to a frightened whisper. She says the mountain itself is warning her about something. Darius felt the back of his neck prickle. Hallucinations weren't among the symptoms Serena had described as typical of plant toxin exposure. Either Rebecca's case was more severe than the others, or she was experiencing something else entirely. Serena took Rebecca's pulse and checked her pupils with the quick efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar cases before. But Darius noticed her frowning as she worked, as if the symptoms weren't matching her expectations. "Rebecca," Serena said gently, "can you tell me what you're seeing right now?" The young woman's eyes, normally bright brown like her father's, seemed unfocused as she turned towards Serena's voice. "The water," she whispered. "There's something wrong with the water. The old woman is trying to tell me, but her voice is so faint." "What old woman?" Darius asked, moving closer. "The one who lives in the stones. She says—" Rebecca's voice trailed off, and her eyes suddenly focused with startling clarity on Darius's face. "She says you need to look in the place where memories are kept, before they silence her forever." Elena gasped, and Darius felt his heart skip. In Ravencrest tradition, the place where memories are kept referred to the archives beneath the Great Hall, where generations of records were stored in carefully maintained chambers carved from the living rock. "Rebecca, how do you know about the archives?" he asked. But the young woman's eyes had already lost their unusual clarity, returning to the confused, frightened expression of someone in the grip of toxic exposure. Whatever brief moment of lucidity she had experienced was gone. Serena administered a remedy that seemed to ease Rebecca's symptoms, but Darius could see the concern in her eyes as she worked. When they stepped outside to speak privately, her first words confirmed his fears. "Those weren't typical symptoms of plant toxin exposure," she said. "The hallucinations, the specific nature of what she was seeing that suggests something else is at work here. Such as, there are certain fungi that grow in underground environments, particularly in places where organic matter has been stored for long periods. If someone has been tampering with your archives, introducing materials that would encourage fungal growth, the spores could cause the kind of symptoms Rebecca exhibited." The implications made Darius's blood run cold. "You're saying someone might have contaminated our historical records?" "I'm saying it's possible. And if Rebecca's hallucination contained actual information about where to look for evidence, then we need to take it seriously." That afternoon, while the council meeting convened in the Great Hall above, Darius and Serena descended into the archives beneath. The passages were older than the main settlement, carved by the original founders of Ravencrest when they first sought shelter in the mountain's embrace. Oil lamps flickered in wall niches, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. The main archive chamber stretched away into darkness, lined with stone shelves that held centuries of records. Scrolls, bound volumes, and carved tablets documented everything from trade agreements to weather patterns, from birth records to the philosophical debates that had shaped their society. But something was wrong. Even before they lit additional lamps to brighten the space, Darius could smell it, a musty, organic odor that spoke of decay and contamination. And when the light revealed the full extent of the chamber, he understood why Rebecca's vision had been so urgent. Someone had been systematically destroying their historical records. Entire sections of shelving stood empty, the documents that had once filled them reduced to scattered fragments and moldering scraps. What remained showed signs of deliberate contamination, water damage that had been carefully arranged to appear natural, fungal growth that had been encouraged rather than prevented. "They're destroying your cultural memory," Serena breathed, running her fingers over the remains of what had once been a beautifully illuminated chronicle. "Someone is trying to erase specific parts of your history." Darius felt a rage unlike anything he had experienced since Helena's disappearance. The archives weren't just records, they were the foundation of Ravencrest's identity, the accumulated wisdom of generations, the proof of their community's resilience and continuity. To destroy them was an act of violence against everything his people stood for. What could be so damaging that someone would go to these lengths to hide it, he asked. Something that would expose them, Serena replied. Look at the pattern of destruction. It's not random. They've targeted specific time periods, particular types of records. If we can figure out what they were trying to hide. They spent the next hour carefully examining what remained, looking for patterns in the destruction. Gradually, a picture emerged that chilled Darius to his core. The destroyed records primarily dated from a period roughly 25 years ago, when a series of disputes between Ravencrest and neighboring communities had been resolved through what the official histories called diplomatic negotiations. But in the fragments that remained, Darius found references to events that had never been part of his understanding of that period. Mentions of sabotage, of communities that had been weakened by mysterious illnesses before agreeing to unfavorable terms. References to someone called the Architect, who had orchestrated a campaign of subtle warfare that avoided open conflict while achieving decisive victory. My God, he whispered, holding up a partially legible document. They've done this before. 25 years ago, someone used the same tactics against our neighbors that they're using against us now. Serena leaned over his shoulder to read the fragment, and he was momentarily distracted by her nearness, by the way her hair smelled of mountain herbs and determination. But her words brought his attention back to the devastating implications of their discovery. And if the same person is responsible for both campaigns, she said quietly, then we're looking for someone who has been in a position of influence in Ravencrest for at least 25 years. Someone with the patience to plan decades in advance and the coldness to poison their own people to achieve their goals. The list of suspects had just narrowed considerably. Among the current council members, only Elder Matthias and Elder Sarah had been in positions of authority 25 years ago. But Darius knew there were others in the community with influence and access who might fit the profile. Thomas the Builder, who managed much of the community's infrastructure, or even some of the senior crafters whose families had been part of Ravencrest's leadership for generations. We need to find more evidence before we make any accusations, Darius said. But if whoever is behind this realizes we've discovered the archive tampering, they'll accelerate their timeline, Serena finished, which means more people will get sick, and Helena, if she's still alive, will be in even greater danger. They were gathering the most important fragments when footsteps echoed in the passage leading to the archives. Someone was coming, and from the confident stride, it was someone who had every right to be there. Darius quickly extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only enough light to navigate safely. In the reduced illumination, the archive chamber became a maze of shadows and hidden corners. He guided Serena behind a tall shelf of stone tablets, pressing close enough to her that he could feel the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. The footsteps entered the main chamber, and a voice that Darius recognized with a sinking heart began speaking in low, urgent tones. The investigation is proceeding faster than anticipated, Elder Matthias said to someone who remained out of sight. The healer is more knowledgeable than we expected, and Darius is asking questions that suggest he's found Helena's research. Then perhaps it's time to implement the final phase, replied a second voice, one that made Darius's blood freeze. It was Elder Sarah, the woman who had delivered him as a baby, who had taught him the history of their people, who had been like a grandmother to him throughout his childhood. The community isn't ready for that level of disruption, Matthias protested. If we move too quickly now, we risk exposure. And if we wait too long, we risk discovery, Sarah replied with chilling pragmatism. Better to control the chaos than be consumed by it. Begin the next round of contamination tonight. Target the families most likely to support Darius if this comes to open conflict. Darius felt Serena's hand grip his arm as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Two of his most trusted advisors, people he had looked to for guidance and wisdom his entire life, were not only responsible for poisoning their own community, but were planning to escalate their campaign to include targeted attacks on his supporters. The footsteps began moving away from their hiding place, but Sarah's final words carried clearly through the chamber. "And find Helena. The architect's patience has limits, and she knows too much to be allowed to remain free much longer." When the archives fell silent again, Darius and Serena remained hidden for several more minutes, neither trusting their voices or their ability to move without betraying their emotional state. Finally, Serena whispered what they were both thinking. "The architect isn't Matthias or Sarah. They're working for someone else, someone whose identity they're protecting even from each other." Darius nodded, his mind racing through the implications. If Helena was still alive and in hiding, she was running out of time. If the poisoning campaign was about to escalate, innocent families would suffer. And if there was someone above Matthias and Sarah orchestrating all of this, then the conspiracy reached deeper into Ravencrest's power structure than he had imagined possible. But there was something else, something that had been growing between him and Serena throughout their investigation, a connection that went beyond their shared determination to uncover the truth. In the darkness of the archives, pressed close together and facing dangers neither had anticipated, Darius found himself seeing her not just as an ally, but as someone whose strength and intelligence complemented his own in ways he hadn't experienced since the early days with Helena. The thought filled him with guilt, even as it stirred feelings he had believed buried with his lost love. Helena was still out there somewhere, possibly in mortal danger, and he was developing feelings for another woman. Yet Serena's presence in his life had awakened something he thought had died: the capacity to trust, to hope, to imagine a future beyond grief and responsibility. As they carefully made their way out of the contaminated archives, carrying with them evidence that would either save their community or destroy it, Darius realized that the next phase of their investigation would test not only their courage and intelligence, but the growing bond between them. Because whatever came next, they would face it together, and the consequences would reshape not only Ravencrest, but the very foundations of who they were as individuals and as partners in a quest for truth that had become far more personal than either had expected. The revelation that Elder Matthias and Elder Sarah were conspirators sent shockwaves through everything Darius had believed about loyalty and trust. As he and Serena made their way through the moonlit passages back to his chambers, every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every familiar face could mask betrayal. The weight of protecting his community while not knowing who else might be working against him felt crushing. Yet Serena's presence beside him provided an anchor of certainty in a world that had become treacherous beyond recognition. "We need to find Helena before they do," Serena said, as they reached the safety of his private quarters. "If this architect has been planning for decades, Helena's knowledge makes her the greatest threat to their entire operation." Darius paced before the cold fireplace, his mind racing through possibilities. But where would she go? Helena knows these mountains better than anyone, but so do our enemies. Any cave or shelter I can think of, they would know as well. Unless, Serena said thoughtfully, she went somewhere that predates current knowledge, somewhere that only appears in the oldest records, the ones that might have been destroyed or overlooked. The idea sparked a memory that made Darius stop mid-stride. "The Sanctuary of Echoes," he breathed. "It's mentioned in the founding chronicles, but most people think it's legend. A hidden valley where the first settlers sought refuge during the worst winter storms." "The chronicles that are kept separate from the main archives?" Serena asked. in my personal study. The leadership chronicles that pass from one leader to the next. Darius was already moving toward the locked cabinet where he kept the most sacred documents of his office. If Helena remembered the descriptions, if she could find it, the ancient text was written in the formal script of Ravencrest's founders, but as Darius read aloud, the directions became clear. A hidden valley, accessible only through a passage behind the Falls of Sorrow, 3 days' journey into the deepest wilderness. A place where natural springs provided warmth even in winter, where caves offered shelter that could house dozens of people, where someone could survive indefinitely if they had the knowledge and supplies. She could be there, Serena said, her voice filled with the first real hope they had felt in days. But if we're right, and if they're closing in on her location, we leave tonight, Darius decided. But first, we need to ensure the community's safety while we're gone. If Matthias and Sarah are planning to escalate the poisoning, people will die while we're searching for Helena. Serena moved to her pack and began extracting small vials of clear liquid. I've been preparing antidotes based on the toxins I've identified. These won't cure existing symptoms, but they'll prevent new exposure. The question is how to distribute them without alerting the conspirators to what we know. The solution came to Darius with the clarity that had once made him an effective leader. Tomorrow is the Harvest Festival. Everyone will gather in the Great Hall for the communal meal. If we could find a way to add your antidotes to the drinking water served at the feast, it could work, Serena agreed. But we'll need someone we absolutely trust to handle the distribution while we're away. The list of people Darius could trust with absolute certainty had grown devastatingly short. But there was one person whose loyalty he had never questioned, whose integrity was beyond reproach. Thomas the Builder. He's managed our water systems for 20 years. If anyone would notice tampering, it would be him. And more importantly, his daughter Rebecca just experienced the worst symptoms. He'll understand the urgency. They spent the next hour crafting a plan that would protect the community while giving them the best chance of reaching Helena before their enemies did. Thomas would be told about the antidotes, but not the full scope of the conspiracy, protecting him from retaliation if their mission failed. The antidotes would be introduced to the festival water supply in concentrations that would appear medicinal rather than suspicious. And if anyone questioned the slightly bitter taste, it would be attributed to seasonal herbs added for traditional purposes. As dawn approached, they prepared for what might be their final journey together. Darius packed supplies for an extended mountain expedition, while Serena gathered the medical equipment and protective herbs they might need. The domesticity of the moment, working together with quiet efficiency, anticipating each other's needs, stirred emotions in Darius that he had been trying to suppress. "Serena," he said quietly as she checked her climbing gear, "after we find Helena, after we expose the conspiracy and save the community, what will you do?" She paused in her preparations, and he caught a flicker of something vulnerable in her expression before she composed herself. "I'll go wherever I'm needed next. There are other communities, other people who might be facing similar threats. And if you were needed here, if Ravencrest needed you to stay?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Serena's eyes met his, and he saw in them the same conflict he felt, the growing connection between them, battling against loyalty to Helena and the uncertainty of what they would find in the hidden valley. "Ask me again when this is over," she said softly, "when we know what the future holds for all of us." They left Ravencrest as the first rays of sunlight touched the mountain peaks, taking paths known only to the most experienced climbers. The journey to the Falls of Sorrow required traversing terrain that had claimed lives even among the sure-footed, but Darius's urgency drove him forward with reckless determination. Every hour they delayed was another hour for the Architect's agents to close in on Helena's hiding place. Serena proved to be an exceptional climbing companion. her movements confident and economical as she navigated the treacherous mountain faces. They traveled in companionable silence for the most part, saving their breath for the demanding ascent. But during their brief rests, Darius found himself sharing stories of Helena, of their life together, of the plans they had made that would never come to fruition. She wanted children, he said as they sheltered from wind in a shallow cave on the second day. We tried for years, but it never happened. She said perhaps the mountains knew that our calling was to care for the entire community as our family. Serena listened without judgment, her presence a comfort that didn't diminish his grief, but somehow made it bearable. She sounds like someone who found meaning in whatever circumstances she faced, she observed. Yes, and now she's facing circumstances I can't even imagine because of threats I failed to see. The guilt in his voice was raw, unfiltered. What kind of leader allows his people to be poisoned for months without noticing? What kind of partner fails to recognize when the person he loves is investigating threats to their community? The kind who trusted people he should have been able to trust, Serena replied firmly. The kind who believed in the integrity of the system he inherited. Darius, you can't blame yourself for not seeing deception that was designed to be invisible. Her faith in him stirred feelings of protectiveness and tenderness that Darius wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Instead, he focused on the mission ahead, on the hope that they would reach Helena in time, on the determination to expose and destroy the conspiracy that had nearly torn his world apart. On the third day, they reached the Falls of Sorrow, where mountain water cascaded down sheer cliff faces in a display of raw, natural power that had inspired poets and pilgrims for generations. But today, Darius saw it only as an obstacle between him and the woman who held the keys to saving his community. The passage behind the falls was exactly where the ancient chronicles had indicated, but it was nearly invisible until they were close enough to feel the spray of the water on their faces. A narrow opening in the rock, partially concealed by the constant flow, led into darkness that seemed to swallow their lamplight. If Helena came this way, she would have had to do it alone, in winter conditions, Serena observed, as they prepared to enter the passage. That requires incredible courage and determination. Or incredible desperation, Darius replied grimly. The passage wound through the mountain's heart for what felt like hours, sometimes opening into chambers large enough to house gatherings, sometimes narrowing to gaps that forced them to crawl single file. But gradually they began to sense a change in the air, a warmth that spoke of thermal springs, a freshness that suggested open space ahead. The Sanctuary of Echoes exceeded even the founding chronicles' descriptions. They emerged into a hidden valley surrounded by peaks so tall they blocked out much of the sky, creating a sense of otherworldly isolation. Natural hot springs dotted the valley floor, their mineral-rich waters supporting vegetation that remained green despite the approaching winter. Caves opened into the valley walls at various levels, some clearly natural formations and others showing signs of ancient human habitation. And in the largest of the inhabited caves, they found evidence that someone had indeed been living here recently. "Helena!" Darius called, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "Helena! It's Darius! I've come to bring you home." The response came not from the caves, but from behind them, where the passage they had just traversed was suddenly blocked by a familiar figure. Elder Matthias emerged from concealment, no longer the kindly advisor Darius had known, but transformed into something cold and calculating. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Matthias said, and his voice carried none of the warmth Darius remembered. "You see, Helena's usefulness ended when she began asking inconvenient questions, just as yours has ended now that you've learned too much to be allowed to live." Behind Matthias came two younger men Darius recognized as recent arrivals to Ravencrest, newcomers who had been welcomed into the community, but who now revealed themselves as agents of the conspiracy. They carried weapons and moved with the coordinated efficiency of people accustomed to violence. "Where is she?" Darius demanded, stepping protectively in front of Serena. "What have you done with Helena?" "She's safe," said a new voice, one that sent chills down Darius's spine. Elder Sarah emerged from one of the higher caves, but she was not alone. With her was Helena, alive but clearly held against her will, her hands bound and her face bearing the strain of months in captivity. The sight of Helena, thinner than he remembered, her hair streaked with premature grey, her eyes holding depths of pain and defiance, filled Darius with a rage so pure it nearly overwhelmed his ability to think strategically. She was alive, but she had been suffering while he searched for her, had been prisoner while he grieved her loss. "Darius!" Helena called, her voice strong despite her circumstances. "Don't trust them. The architect isn't who you think." "It's enough," Sarah commanded, pressing something sharp against Helena's throat. "She's said quite enough already." But Helena's eyes met Darius's across the valley, and in them he saw a message that chilled him more than Sarah's threats. Helena was trying to tell him something crucial, something about the architect's identity that would change everything he thought he knew about the conspiracy. "You want to know who the architect is?" Matthias asked, apparently enjoying Darius's confusion. "You want to understand how someone could plan this campaign for decades, could build the networks necessary to poison multiple communities, could maintain such perfect operational security?" Darius felt Serena tense beside him, and suddenly pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. The timing of her arrival, her unusual knowledge of mountain toxins, her immediate ability to identify patterns that had escaped everyone else's notice. "No," he breathed, turning to look at Serena with growing horror. "Tell me it's not true." But Serena's expression had changed, the warmth and determination he had grown to love, replaced by something colder, more calculating. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority he had never heard before. "I'm sorry, Darius," she said, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of genuine regret in her eyes. "I never intended for you to be hurt by this, but Ravencrest has resources that my people need, and your community's strategic location makes it essential to our long-term plans." The betrayal cut deeper than anything Darius had ever experienced. Not only had he lost Helena to deception, but he had allowed himself to develop feelings for the very person responsible for orchestrating that loss. The woman he had begun to trust, to care for, to imagine a future with, was the architect of everything that had destroyed his world. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because 25 years ago, your community's aggressive expansion policies destroyed mine," Serena replied, and now he could hear the old pain beneath her controlled exterior. "My family, my friends, everyone I loved, gone because Ravencrest decided their resources were more valuable in your hands than ours." But that was a generation ago, yes. But some wounds take time to heal properly. Some justice requires patience. Serena's expression softened slightly. "I'd never expected to care about you, Darius. That wasn't part of the plan. But caring about someone doesn't change the necessity of what must be done." Darius felt the world shifting beneath his feet as he understood the full scope of what had happened. Serena hadn't arrived at Ravencrest by coincidence. She had orchestrated everything: Helena's investigation, her own timely arrival, even the growing connection between them, as part of a revenge campaign that had been decades in the making. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you make a choice," Serena said. "You can fight us and watch both Helena and your community suffer the consequences. Or you can accept that Ravencrest's time as an independent power has ended, that the future belongs to those with the vision to unite these mountains under more enlightened leadership." But even as she spoke, Darius noticed something that gave him hope. Helena's bonds were not as secure as they appeared, and she had been working to free herself while attention was focused on the confrontation below. More importantly, the thermal springs that made the valley hospitable also created air currents that could carry sound in unexpected directions. If he could create enough distraction. "You're right about one thing," he said, raising his voice to carry across the valley. "The future does belong to those with vision, but you've made one crucial mistake in your planning, Serena." "What mistake is that?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You assume that love makes people weak," Darius replied, "but sometimes it makes them desperate enough to attempt the impossible." He lunged forward, not at Serena, but toward the thermal spring nearest to the cave where Helena was held. The scalding water would provide cover and confusion, and if his desperate plan worked, the resulting chaos would give Helena the opportunity she needed to break free. The next few minutes became a blur of violence and desperation. Darius fought with the fury of a man who had lost everything and the determination of a leader protecting his people. Serena's agents were skilled, but they hadn't expected such suicidal tactics, and their careful plans began to unravel in the face of his reckless assault. Helena broke free of her restraints and joined the fight, her months of captivity having done nothing to diminish her fierce spirit. Together, she and Darius fought their way toward the passage that led back to the outside world, while behind them, the carefully orchestrated conspiracy collapsed into violence and chaos. "The antidotes," Helena gasped as they reached the passage entrance. "Did you protect the community?" "Thomas has them," Darius replied. "By now, everyone at the Harvest Festival will have been immunized." "Then we won," she said, her voice filled with exhaustion and relief. "Whatever else happens, we saved them." But their escape was cut short by Serena's voice, calling after them with something that sounded almost like genuine anguish. "Darius, wait!" He turned to see her standing at the edge of the thermal springs, no longer the composed architect of elaborate schemes, but a woman whose carefully constructed plans had crumbled around her. Blood from a cut on her forehead ran down her face, and her eyes held a pain that seemed to go beyond physical injury. "It doesn't have to end like this," she called. "The community can survive, can even prosper under new leadership. Your people don't have to suffer for the crimes of previous generations." "You're right," Darius replied, his voice carrying across the valley with absolute conviction. "They don't have to suffer, but neither do yours. The cycle of revenge ends here, Serena, today." He could have killed her then. His position at the passage entrance gave him tactical advantage, and justice might have demanded her death for the suffering she had caused. But instead he made a choice that surprised everyone present, including himself. "Go," he said. "Take your surviving agents and leave these mountains. If you're truly seeking justice for your people rather than simple revenge, then find a way to build something new instead of destroying what others have built. But if you ever threaten Ravencrest again, if you ever harm innocent people in pursuit of your goals, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Serena stared at him for a long moment, and he thought he saw tears in her eyes before she turned away. "You're a better man than I expected," she said quietly. "Perhaps too good for this world." As they emerged from the hidden valley and began the journey home, Helena walked beside Darius in companionable silence. The months of separation and suffering had changed them both, but the bonds between them, forged through shared trials rather than simple affection, proved stronger than the deceptions that had temporarily broken them. "Do you think she'll keep trying?" Helena asked as they navigated the treacherous mountain paths. "I don't know," Darius replied honestly, "but I think we showed her that there are other ways to heal old wounds than inflicting new ones." When they finally reached Ravencrest 3 days later, they found a community that had been transformed by crisis into something stronger and more unified than before. The Harvest Festival had proceeded without incident. The antidotes had prevented new casualties, and the exposure of Matthias and Sarah's treachery had led to a thorough examination of community structures that revealed other weaknesses and vulnerabilities. But more importantly, the experience had taught everyone, leaders and followers alike, that true strength came not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from the flexibility to adapt when circumstances demanded change. Darius resumed his leadership role, but with a new understanding of the responsibility it entailed. Helena returned to her work as community advocate, but with expanded authority to investigate concerns before they became crises. And together, they began the work of rebuilding not just their relationship, but the very foundations of how Ravencrest would face the challenges of an uncertain future. The scars left by Serena's campaign would take time to heal completely. Trust, once broken, required patience and consistent action to restore. But as autumn gave way to winter and the community prepared for the annual cycle of survival and renewal, Darius found himself cautiously optimistic about what lay ahead. Late one evening, as snow began to fall on the mountain peaks that surrounded their home, Helena joined him on the balcony of their shared chambers. She moved closer to him, and he wrapped his arms around her, grateful beyond words for her presence, her strength, her forgiveness of his failures during her absence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" she asked quietly. "If Serena's community hadn't been destroyed, if she hadn't felt the need for revenge?" "I try not to," Darius replied. "But sometimes I think about the fact that pain, left untreated, can poison everything it touches. That's why we have to do better, not just for ourselves, but for the communities that will come after us." Helena nodded, her eyes reflecting the lamplight from within their chambers. "The mountains have long memories," she said, quoting an old proverb. "But they also have the patience to wait for healing." As they stood together watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful, Darius understood that their story, like the mountains themselves, would endure through seasons of darkness and light, destruction and renewal. They had survived betrayal and separation, conspiracy and violence, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The future stretched before them, like an uncharted path through mountain wilderness, dangerous, uncertain, but filled with possibilities for those brave enough to face it together. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The chance to build something meaningful with the people they loved, in the place they called home, despite all the forces that sought to tear it down. The mountains kept their secrets, but they also protected those wise enough to listen to their ancient lessons about endurance, renewal, and the patient work of love in a world that too often chose hatred instead.